Picture the scene. It is January 16th, 1920. Across the United States, the mood is split right down the middle. In some quarters, there is jubilation. Church bells are ringing, temperance leagues are singing hymns, and there is a genuine belief that a new era of moral purity is dawning. But in the dimly lit saloons of New York, Chicago, and New Orleans, the mood is more akin to a funeral. Patrons are staring into their final glasses of whiskey, gin, and beer. The clock is ticking toward midnight. The 18th Amendment is about to take effect. The sale of intoxicating liquors is banned. The party, as America knew it, is over. It is a moment of profound cultural shock. Historians often focus on what vanished that night: the shuttered breweries, the empty tap rooms, the sudden criminalization of a glass of wine with dinner. We look at the rise of the mob, the Tommy guns, and the speakeasies. But there is another side to this story, a side that is sweeter, colder, and surprisingly lucrative. Because when the alcohol tops ran dry, the American appetite for vice didn't just disappear, it transferred. That is exactly right. Humans are creatures of habit, and more importantly, we are creatures of chemistry. We crave the dopamine hit, the social ritual, the calorie rush. When the Volstead Act cut off the supply of ethanol, the American public didn't just go home and drink water. They went looking for a substitute, and they found it in something that seems entirely innocent today, but at the time became the centerpiece of a new booming economy: ice cream. The statistics are staggering. We aren't talking about a minor uptick in sales. We are talking about a fundamental shift in the American diet. Before Prohibition, ice cream was a seasonal treat, a luxury for the upper classes, or something you had at a 4th of July picnic. But within the first few years of the Noble experiment, ice cream consumption in the United States skyrocketed by 55%. It became a phenomenon. It is the great untold story of the Roaring Twenties. While Al Capone was building an empire on bootleg rye, legitimate businessmen were building empires on vanilla, chocolate, and strawberry. Breweries were converting into ice cream factories. Saloons were being gutted and retrofitted into soda fountains. The U.S. Navy would eventually get involved, treating ice cream not just as dessert, but as a tactical necessity for morale. Today, we are going to dive into the ice cream boom. We will look at how the death of the bar led to the birth of the ice cream parlor, and how a constitutional ban on booze turned America into a nation of sugar addicts. To really understand the magnitude of this shift, we have to look at the landscape before 1920. We need to understand the plight of the American brewer. Imagine you are running a massive operation like Anheuser-Busch or Yuengling in 1918. You can see the writing on the wall. The temperance movement isn't just a fringe group anymore. They have political power. They are passing state laws. The federal amendment is looming. You have millions of dollars invested in very specific equipment. That is the crucial economic pivot point. A brewery is essentially a giant refrigeration plant. You have massive cold storage facilities, you have a fleet of refrigerated trucks or rail cars for distribution, and you have bottling lines. If you can't make beer, you are sitting on a mountain of useless capital, unless you find a product that requires the exact same infrastructure. And that product was ice cream. It wasn't just a clever idea, it was a survival strategy. Take Yuengling, for example. They are America's oldest brewery, based in Pottsville, Pennsylvania. When it became clear that beer was illegal, Frank Yuengling didn't fold. He launched the Yuengling's Ice Cream Corporation in 1920. They utilized their dairy operations, which many breweries had, and their cold storage to pump out ice cream. And they weren't alone. Anheuser-Busch launched a line of frozen products. Stroh's in Detroit, another massive brewing family, switched their entire focus to ice cream. If you grew up in Detroit, Stroh's wasn't just a beer name. It was the premier ice cream brand for decades.
There is also a physiological component here that we cannot ignore. Alcohol is a carbohydrate. It is energy dense. When people stop drinking heavily, their bodies often crave sugar to replace those missing calories. The temperance movement actually knew this. They encouraged people to eat candy and ice cream as a way to ward off the temptation of the saloon. There were actual slogans and pamphlets suggesting that a bowl of ice cream would satisfy the unruly thirst that led men to ruin. It is fascinating that the dries, the supporters of Prohibition, unintentionally fueled the sugar boom. They thought they were promoting a wholesome alternative. And in a way they were. The saloon was a male-dominated, often rough environment. But the ice cream parlor, the soda fountain, that was acceptable for women and children. It opened up the vice economy to the entire demographic of the country. Suddenly, dating culture shifted from the bar to the soda fountain. The ice cream social became the dominant form of community gathering, and we have to talk about the technology. Before this era, ice cream was difficult. You needed ice harvested from lakes in the winter, stored in sawdust. It was labor-intensive. But the 1920s saw the rapid maturation of mechanical refrigeration. It coincided perfectly with Prohibition. You had the breweries needing to use their mechanical cooling tech, and you had the demand spiking. It created a perfect storm for mass production. Ice cream went from being a hand-cranked Sunday treat to an industrial product that could be shipped and stored. So the 18th Amendment drops, and the floodgates of sugar open. Let's talk about the cultural institution that replaced the saloon, the soda fountain. By the mid-1920s, the soda fountain was the center of American social life. Drugstores had them, department stores had them, and they were opulent. We are talking about marble counters, Tiffany lamps, polished brass. They were designed to mimic the grandeur of the old bars, but with a brighter, cleaner aesthetic. And they had their own bartenders, the soda jerk. This wasn't just a guy scooping vanilla. This was a performance artist. The name comes from the jerking motion used to pull the handle of the soda draft arm. These guys were celebrities in their neighborhoods. They had their own slang. If you wanted a glass of milk, they'd yell cow juice. If you wanted a chocolate soda, they had a code for that. They flipped scoops behind their backs. It was theater, and it filled the void left by the bartender. People still wanted to go somewhere where everybody knew their name, to borrow a phrase. The innovation during this specific decade was relentless. Because the market was so hot, companies were desperate to create the next big thing. In 1920, the same year Prohibition starts, Harry Burt in Youngstown, Ohio creates the Good Humor Bar. He's the first guy to freeze ice cream onto a stick and coat it in chocolate. But he has a problem. How do you distribute it? He looks at the new automobile culture and decides to create a fleet of white trucks with bells. The ice cream truck is born directly out of this 1920s boom. Then, just a year later in 1921, you have the Eskimo pie. Christian Nelson, a school teacher in Iowa, sees a kid in a candy shop unable to decide between a chocolate bar and ice cream. He thinks, why not both? He partners with Russell Stover, yes, that Russell Stover, and they patent the chocolate-covered ice cream bar. It was an overnight sensation. We are talking about millions sold in the first year. The stock price of the company making the foil wrappers skyrocketed, and let's not forget the popsicle. Frank Epperson had technically discovered it by accident back in 1905 when he left a soda with a stirring stick out on a freezing porch, but he didn't patent it and launch it until 1923. Why? Because the market was finally ready. The 1920s public was obsessed with frozen treats. The Epsicle, as he called it, became the popsicle, and it joined the arsenal of desserts that defined the decade.
It wasn't just about the products. It was about the spending power. The 1920s was an era of perceived prosperity. People had pocket money. A nickel for an ice cream cone was an affordable luxury. But the volume is what is staggering. The per capita consumption went through the roof. It became a billion-dollar industry. We often think of the 20s as the era of the flapper and the gin fizz, but statistically, it was much more the era of the sundae and the milkshake. The speakeasy gets all the movie glory, but the soda fountain was where the majority of Americans were actually spending their Friday nights. The consequences of this boom extended far beyond the repeal of Prohibition in 1933. You might think that once alcohol was legal again, the ice cream market would crash. But it didn't. The habit had been formed. A generation had grown up associating socialization with ice cream. The breweries that had converted, like Yuengling and Stroh's, eventually went back to making beer, but many kept their ice cream divisions for decades because they were so profitable. And this brings us to one of the most surreal consequences of America's ice cream obsession: the United States Navy. The military took note of how essential ice cream had become to morale. During the Prohibition years, the Navy had already begun removing alcohol from ships, years before the civilian ban in some cases. By the time World War II arrived, the generation that had been raised on Prohibition-era ice cream was now a fighting age. The demand was non-negotiable. This is where the story gets truly wild. In 1945, the U.S. Navy spent $1 million to build a concrete barge in the Pacific. It wasn't an ammunition ship, it wasn't a fuel tanker, it was a floating ice cream factory. It was designed to produce 10 gallons of ice cream every 7 minutes. It had massive storage freezers. It would be towed around the Pacific Theater, hooking up to destroyers and cruisers to offload thousands of gallons of vanilla and chocolate. Just think about that logistics chain. In the middle of the greatest conflict in human history, the U.S. military decided that ice cream was so vital to the mental health of the sailor that they poured concrete and steel into making it mobile. This tracks directly back to the consumption habits formed in the 1920s.
The dry Navy needed a substitute for the grog ration, and the American sailor, raised in the golden age of the soda fountain, demanded ice cream. There is a famous story about the carrier USS Lexington. When it was sinking during the Battle of the Coral Sea, the sailors broke into the ship's freezer and ate all the ice cream before abandoning ship. They were sliding down the ropes with helmets full of ice cream. That is the level of devotion we are talking about, and that devotion was forged in the dry years of the 1920s. So when we look at the modern American supermarket with its entire aisle dedicated to frozen desserts, we are looking at the legacy of the 18th Amendment. We are looking at the remnants of a time when the government took away the bottle and the market replaced it with the scoop. The brands we know, Good Humor, Popsicle, even the existence of the soft serve industry, all have their roots in that frantic, dry decade. Prohibition was intended to purify the nation, to strip away its vices. Instead, it just swapped one vice for another sweeter one. It taught American business that if you close one door, you can just knock down the wall and build a drive-through window. It turns out you can ban the booze, but you can't ban the buzz. Sometimes that buzz just comes from a sugar rush. Thanks for listening to this exploration of the ice cream boom. We'll see you next time for another slice of hidden history.
It really is a statistic that stops you in your tracks. Between 1920 and 1929, ice cream consumption in the United States didn't just go up a little bit, it skyrocketed by 55%. We went from a nation that enjoyed ice cream as an occasional treat to a nation that was absolutely obsessed with it. And the timing is not a coincidence. On January 16, 1920, the 18th Amendment goes into effect. The Volstead Act is the law of the land. Alcohol is illegal. The saloons close their doors. And suddenly, millions of Americans have a vacuum in their social lives, and interestingly enough, in their dietary habits. That dietary aspect is where the science gets interesting. When you stop drinking alcohol, especially if you are a regular drinker, your body craves something to replace those simple carbohydrates. Alcohol converts to sugar in the body. When you take the booze away, the body screams for sugar. And what is the most delicious, readily available source of fat and sugar? Ice cream. Exactly, it was the comfort gap. You couldn't get a whiskey sour, so you got a sundae. But before we get into the consumer side, we have to look at the producers. This is an economic story first. Imagine you are a brewery in 1919. You see the writing on the wall. Prohibition is coming. Your entire business model is about to become a felony. What do? This is the pivot that saved some of America's biggest companies. Think about the infrastructure of a brewery. You have massive refrigeration units. You have a cold chain distribution network. You have trucks designed to keep things cool. You have huge mixing vats. If you can't brew beer, what product uses almost the exact same equipment? Ice cream. It was the perfect lifeboat. The most famous example is probably Yuengling and Son. They are America's oldest brewery, based in Pottsville, Pennsylvania. Frank Yuengling was running the show, and he refused to close down. He looked at his plant and said, "We are making ice cream." And they didn't just dabble in it. They launched Yuengling's ice cream, and it became incredibly popular. And they weren't alone. Anheuser-Busch did the same thing. They had these massive refrigerated rail cars that used to transport Budweiser across the country. Suddenly, those cars are filled with frozen dairy products. It kept the lights on, it kept the workers employed. If those breweries hadn't pivoted to ice cream, we might not have those beer brands today. It's amazing to think that the survival of American beer depended on American ice cream. But let's move from the factory to the street. The cultural landscape was shifting. The saloon was a male-dominated space. It was dark, it smelled like stale beer, and respectable women generally didn't hang out there. When the saloons closed, the social center of gravity shifted to the soda fountain and the ice cream parlor. This was a massive democratization of public leisure. The ice cream parlor was bright, it was clean, it was family-friendly, and crucially, it was a place where women could go unchaperoned or on dates without the stigma attached to a bar. The soda jerk became the new bartender. He was the cool guy behind the counter, flipping scoops, mixing phosphates, and creating this whole new language. The lingo is fantastic. If you wanted a chocolate soda, you asked to burn one. If you wanted a glass of water, you asked for a city juice. And if you wanted a banana split, sometimes they'd call it a houseboat. It was a performance. And unlike the speakeasies, which were hidden and exclusive, the ice cream parlor was open to everyone. It became the new third place in American life. Not work, not home, but the parlor. And the industry responded to this new demand with innovation. Prohibition is actually the golden age of ice cream invention. We take things like the Popsicle and the Klondike bar for granted, but they were born in this era. The pressure to create new, exciting treats to replace the excitement of a cocktail led to an explosion of creativity.
Let's talk about the Eskimo pie. This is a quintessential Prohibition-era story. It was 1920, the very first year of Prohibition. A man named Christian Nelson, who was a school teacher and candy store owner in Iowa, saw a boy in his shop struggling to make a decision. He had a nickel, he wanted a chocolate bar, but he also wanted ice cream. He couldn't afford both. The classic dilemma. And Nelson has this light bulb moment. Why not combine them? Why not coat a block of ice cream in chocolate? It sounds simple to us now, but technically it was a nightmare. The hot chocolate would melt the ice cream, or the chocolate would seize up and slide off. It took him weeks of experimenting with cocoa butter ratios to get it right. He partnered with Russell Stover, yes, that Russell Stover, and they patented the ice cream bar, which eventually became the Eskimo pie. And it was an overnight sensation. We are talking about 1 million bars sold a day by 1922. 1 million a day. The stock of the company that made the foil wrappers rose from almost nothing to incredible heights just because of the demand for Eskimo pies. It was the first time people could eat ice cream like a candy bar. You could walk around with it. It was mobile. That mobility is key. In the Roaring '20s, everything was speeding up. Cars were becoming common, people were moving. They didn't always want to sit down with a spoon and a bowl. This leads us to another titan of the era, Harry Burt and the Good Humor Bar. Burt was in Ohio, and he'd created a chocolate-coated ice cream bar too, but his daughter told him it was too messy to eat. The problem of sticky fingers. So Burt suggests putting a stick in it. It sounds trivial, but nobody had done it. He froze the stick into the ice cream, and suddenly you have a handle. But Burt was a marketing genius. He didn't just sell them in shops. He bought a fleet of white trucks, outfitted them with bells, actually they were bells from his son's bobsled, and sent them into the neighborhoods. He brought the ice cream to the people. This was 1920. The same year alcohol is banned, the Good Humor truck is born. It's almost poetic. The government takes away the beer wagon, and the free market replaces it with the ice cream truck. And those white uniforms, they were designed to project cleanliness and sanitation, which was a huge concern at the time. It was the anti-saloon. It was pure, white, sweet, and safe. We also have to mention the popsicle, Frank Epperson. He claims he invented it by accident back in 1905 when he left a soda with a stirring stick on his porch overnight in freezing weather. But he didn't patent it until 1923. Why 1923? Because the market was finally ready. The hunger for frozen treats was at a fever pitch. He called it the Epsicle originally, but his kids called it Popsicle, and the name stuck. So you have this perfect storm. You have the breweries pivoting to production, you have the parlors replacing the saloons, you have the inventors creating portable treats. But there is another player in this story that really institutionalized ice cream in American culture, and that is the United States military, specifically the Navy. This is one of my favorite parts of the history. We tend to associate the ice cream barge with World War II, which we will get to, but the roots are in the Prohibition era. In 1914, Secretary of the Navy Josephus Daniels issued General Order 99. This order banned alcohol aboard all U.S. Navy vessels. The Navy went dry 6 years before the rest of the country. Right, sailors were not happy. Morale took a hit, so the Navy had to find a replacement. They started installing ice cream manufacturing plants on the larger ships. By the time we get to the 1920s and the Prohibition era proper, the Navy had figured out that ice cream was the best way to keep sailors happy. It was high calorie, it was a treat, and it didn't cause brawls like whiskey did.
It became a tactical necessity, but the scale of it is what blows my mind. During the interwar period, the 20s and 30s, the Navy was refining the supply chain. They were training men specifically to be ice cream specialists. So when World War II eventually hit, the infrastructure was already there to scale it up to absurd levels. That's when you get the famous concrete barge. The USS Quartz, we have to describe this. It was a concrete barge in the Pacific Theater, essentially a floating factory designated solely for producing ice cream. It could churn out 10 gallons every 7 minutes. It had no engine, it had to be towed. Its only mission was to be towed around the ocean and dispense vanilla and chocolate to destroyers and aircraft carriers. That level of dedication to dessert starts with the dry policies of the Prohibition era. It really cements the idea that ice cream became a symbol of American comfort. Alcohol was old world vice. Ice cream was new world wholesomeness. It aligned with the Puritan streak that brought about Prohibition in the first place, but it also aligned with the capitalist excess of the Roaring '20s. It was the perfect product for the time. And let's look at the economics of the ingredients, particularly sugar. Prohibitionists had this theory that if people stopped spending money on alcohol, they would put that money into savings accounts or buy household goods like furniture and clothes. They thought it would stabilize the family economy. They were wrong. Completely wrong. The disposable income that used to go to the bartender went straight to the confectioner. Sugar consumption spiked. In 1919, the average American ate about 85 pounds of sugar a year. By the end of the 20s, that number had jumped significantly. The candy industry and the soft drink industry, along with ice cream, saw profits they had never imagined. It created a sugar boom that reshaped American agriculture. It also changed the way we thought about dining out. Before the 20s, dining out was often a formal affair or a tavern affair. The rise of the ice cream parlor and the lunch counter, which often went hand in hand, created the casual dining sector. You could go in, grab a sandwich and a malt, and be out in 20 minutes. It was the precursor to fast food. And Howard Johnson is a name we have to drop here. He started in the 1920s. He bought a small soda fountain in Massachusetts in 1925. He wasn't satisfied with the commercial ice cream available because he thought it was too watery, so he started making his own with a higher butterfat content. He eventually had 28 flavors, a precursor to Baskin-Robbins' 31. His success in the late 20s laid the groundwork for the first major restaurant franchise system. It's interesting you mentioned the butterfat content. That was the arms race of the 1920s. Since they couldn't compete on alcohol content, they competed on creaminess. Commercial ice cream before the war was often just frozen custard or milk ice. During the Prohibition boom, the quality improved drastically because the competition was so fierce. If your parlor had icy, gritty product, the customers would just go down the street to the place with the smooth, rich stuff. There was also a fascinating intersection between the illicit world and the ice cream world. We know about the bootleggers, but speakeasies often used ice cream parlors as fronts. You'd have a perfectly legitimate soda fountain in the front with families eating sundaes and a heavy door in the back leading to the gin joint. It was the perfect camouflage. Who suspects the place selling strawberry cones? It makes sense. You need refrigeration for the beer anyway, so you might as well sell ice cream. Plus, the noise of the ice cream social covered up the noise from the back room. But there were also rumors of mob involvement in the dairy industry itself. In certain cities, controlling the milk supply was lucrative. If you control the milk, you control the ice cream, and you control the cash flow of the legitimate businesses.
We shouldn't overlook the marketing shift either. Before the 20s, ice cream was often advertised as a health food for invalids or a special treat for children. During the 20s, the advertising started targeting adults. You see ads showing couples sharing a split. It became romantic. It became a reward for a hard day's work. They literally repurposed the marketing psychology of the after-work drink and applied it to the after-work scoop. And the flavors. We moved beyond vanilla, chocolate, and strawberry. The 1920s saw the introduction of more complex combinations. Nut toppings became standard. Syrups became more varied. Marshmallow fluff. The complexity of the sundae was a direct response to the complexity of the cocktail. People wanted to customize. They wanted a mixed drink experience, but with fudge instead of rum. Now we have to ask, what happened when Prohibition ended? December 1933. The 21st Amendment is ratified. You can drink again. Did the ice cream bubble burst? Did everyone just drop their cones and run back to the bar? That's the amazing part. It didn't. You would expect a correction, a drop in sales, but ice cream consumption remained high. It had been 13 years. A whole generation, the kids who grew up in the 20s, had been raised on ice cream. It was now hardwired into the American palate. We didn't swap ice cream back for beer. We just decided to have both. In fact, the end of Prohibition just allowed the ice cream industry to merge with the alcohol industry in new ways. Brandy Alexanders, alcoholic milkshakes, these things started to pop up. But the habit was set. The infrastructure was built. The trucks were on the road. The freezers were in the homes. The home freezer is the final piece of this puzzle. In the 1920s, electrical refrigeration for the home was just starting to become a luxury item. By the 30s, it was becoming more common. Once you could store ice cream at home, it transitioned from a going-out treat to a grocery list staple. Prohibition created the desire, but technology cemented the habit. So when we look at the legacy of the 18th Amendment, we usually count the costs, the rise of the mafia, the lost tax revenue, the corruption, but we rarely count the gains. And the biggest gain, undeniably, was the American ice cream industry. It turned a seasonal, occasional sweet into a billion-dollar powerhouse. And it established America as the ice cream capital of the world. Even today, the U.S. consumes more ice cream per capita than almost any other nation. That is a direct lineage to the dry years. We replaced the buzz with the brain freeze, and we never looked back.
It's a reminder that when you try to legislate morality or consumer behavior, the market will always find a way to fill the void. The void just happened to be shaped like a waffle cone. I want to go back to the Navy for a second, though, because I feel like we glossed over just how critical that morale boost was. You mentioned the barge, but the integration of ice cream went down to the submarine level. Oh, absolutely. Submarines are hot, cramped, and miserable places. In the 30s and 40s, having a functional ice cream machine on a sub was considered mission critical. There are stories of commanders prioritizing the repair of the ice cream maker over the repair of the air conditioning. It was the only thing that made the heat bearable. And again, this culture of ice cream as essential ration comes from that 1914-1920 shift. There's a funny story about a carrier, the USS Lexington, in 1942, before the Battle of the Coral Sea. So we are jumping ahead a bit, but the logic holds. The ship was critically damaged and sinking. The order was given to abandon ship. But before they left, the sailors broke into the freezer. They were scooping ice cream into their helmets and eating it on the flight deck while the ship was going down. They weren't going to let it go to waste. That is a level of devotion that speaks volumes.
That is incredible. Helmet Sundays as the ship sinks. But to bring it back to the 20s, that devotion was forged in the soda shops of the Prohibition era. That's where the emotional connection was made. It wasn't just food, it was defiance. In a small way, enjoying these lavish, over-the-top Sundays was a way of partying in a dry nation. It was a vice that was allowed. Let's talk about the visual aesthetic of the brands that emerged. We mentioned good humor, but what about the color palettes? The 1920s was the Art Deco era. Ice cream parlors adopted this style. Chrome, neon, geometric shapes. The presentation of ice cream became high art. The glassware for sundaes became elaborate. It wasn't just a scoop in a bowl. It was a tower of sweetness served in crystal. This elevated the status of the dessert. And we have to talk about the demographics. Children. Before Prohibition, kids obviously liked sweets, but the candy industry was fragmented. The ice cream boom created a unified childhood experience. The sound of the ice cream truck bell became the universal anthem of American childhood. That starts with Harry Burt in 1920. Every kid who runs after a truck today is participating in a ritual started because their great-grandparents couldn't buy beer. It also affected the dairy farmers. The 1920s was a difficult time for agriculture in general, leading up to the Dust Bowl. But dairy farming in the Northeast and Midwest remained relatively stable and profitable, specifically because of the ice cream demand. It saved thousands of family farms from bankruptcy. The milk checks kept coming because the demand for cream never dipped. So we have the brewers, the farmers, the truck drivers, the inventors, and the shop owners all tied into this web. It really was a stimulus package disguised as a dessert. And we should mention the international perspective. Europeans visited America in the 20s and were baffled by this obsession. To the French or the Italians, ice cream was a dessert course. To Americans, it was a snack, a meal, a pastime, a lifestyle. We were eating it in winter. That was unheard of. That's a great point. The winter ice cream market was a specific marketing push in the 20s. Advertisers had to convince people that eating something frozen when it was cold outside wouldn't make you sick. They marketed it as a high-energy food that generated body heat. Eat ice cream to stay warm. The science is shaky, but the marketing worked. And it worked because the parlors were heated. It brings us back to that third place concept. You go to the warm, bright parlor to escape the cold, gray street. You have a sundae. It's comfort. It's affordable luxury. During the economic uncertainty that followed the '29 crash, that affordability became even more important. A nickel for a cone was something almost anyone could scrape together. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to think about the lasting image of Prohibition. We usually picture the flapper with a martini glass, but maybe we should picture the flapper with a double scoop cone. That image is just as historically accurate, if not more so. I think you're right. The martini glass represents the rebellion against the law. The ice cream cone represents the adaptation to the law. Both defined the decade, and while the speakeasies eventually disappeared or turned into legitimate bars, the ice cream parlor evolved into the fast food joint, the Dairy Queen, the frozen yogurt shop. Its DNA is everywhere. It's a legacy that is arguably more enduring than the cocktail culture. Cocktail culture has ups and downs. Ice cream is constant, and it's a testament to American ingenuity. When the government closes a door, we open a freezer. Well put. From Yuengling's survival to the good humor bells, the story of Prohibition is the story of the ice cream boom. Next time you grab a pint from the grocery store or hear that truck coming down the street, remember, you have the 18th Amendment to thank for that. And perhaps we should pour one out for the breweries that didn't make it, or better yet, raise a spoon for the ones that did.
Thanks for listening to this exploration of the frozen side of the Roaring Twenties. We'll see you next time for another scoop of history. Stay cool, everyone.